Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last noon presentation of the year. How are you all feeling? Everybody doing well? Okay, we were just talking about, we're sort of at that place in the semester where people are feeling some low energy. As you know, I'm Shar, this is Heather, and today's presentation is on listening, which we talk a lot about how important it is. And I think honestly that we, for the most part, don't do it very well. So let's start with the book giveaway. The book giveaway today is Difficult Conversations, How to Talk About What Matters Most. Anybody who has heard me talk before knows this is one of my favorite books, but it also happens to have a great section on listening. So Heather, who is going to be receiving copies of the book today?
Yes, so our randomly drawn winners are Kelsey Opat and Lauren Jones.
Awesome. Okay, great. And we'll be sending those out to you. Today we have Jason Howard. He is an instructor in the communication department. He also is our departmental advisor and assistant basic course director. So he has a lot of roles in the department, and he's going to be talking to us about one of his favorite topics because he teaches classes in this, listening. So without any further ado, Jay, take it away.
Everybody, thanks for joining me for your lunch today. And I'm going to try to share my screen at this time. I have two dual screens set up, so bear with me. There we go. You guys see everything there?
Perfect.
That's great, Jay.
All right. So the title of my presentation today is Listening Skills to Improve Communication and Conflict Management. And before I get into it, I want to take a second to thank Shar and the Center for inviting me. And I really want to just pause and express gratitude for how much the Center does for our community and has done over the years. As you know, the Center for Conflict and Dispute Resolution facilitates trainings, research, outreach services, and of course, academic programs as well. I myself am a proud holder of the Graduate Certificate in Conflict and Dispute Resolution. And also, Shar advised my thesis in 2014. So thank you, Shar, for everything that you do, and also Heather, and thanks for facilitating these lunch hour sessions.
I'm just kind of shocked it was 14 that you graduated. Never mind, let's just move along. Okay.
I had to look at the spine of the published book to remind myself of that date because it also struck me as odd. Anyway, I'm your presenter, Jay Howard, newly minted senior instructor in the Department of Comm, and I'm really excited about this session today. As Shar mentioned, the balance of my workload has recently shifted away from the classroom and toward academic advising, which I love academic advising. It is a very listening-centered type of job, but the shift means that I have not been in the classroom for a while. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to get to dig into this material with you today. When I am in the classroom, I teach a number of classes in the department, including COM 326, Effective Listening, which you see listed on the screen. And one of the things that I've learned from that class is that one of the first things we need to do when thinking about listening is to try to become aware of some of the background assumptions that we have about listening. as well as some of the assumptions we may have about ourselves and others, so that we can foreground those assumptions and examine them. So it's fascinating stuff, and we'll try to do a little bit of that today. The subjects of listening and conflict have a lot in common with each other. For example, both subjects have a lot of myths about them, and some of these myths are related. For example, there's the myth that if we would only listen to each other better, then all conflict would cease. And of course, we know that that is not the case for a number of reasons, if only because we know that conflicts can still exist even in the presence of careful and accurate listening. But it is true that listening would go a long way in reducing some needless conflicts that we run into, and it would also make the conflicts that we do have more productive. So today, I want to focus on how listening can not only make the bad times less bad, but also the good times better if we do it right. Today's agenda, we'll talk about a few definition points first. And I want to talk about a concept called verbal person-centeredness and its relationship to listening. We'll talk about listening's role in validating emotions. And then we'll take a look at what it means to respond effectively or ineffectively when someone is expressing emotion. For that feedback bullet point, I want to note that as I go through, there'll be several opportunities for you to interact today. Please feel free to use the chat anytime, and I'll request help making sure I don't miss any comments or questions that may be there. And also, I'll ask you to write some brief responses in the chat at specific times as we go through. For those of you who choose to participate, use the thumbs up and reaction buttons, and chime in verbally if you wish, and there will also be time for questions at the end. Also, for those of you who are quietly eating your lunch with your camera off, which is typically what I do during these sessions, feel free to just psychically send me good vibes. Maybe make twinkle fingers toward your computer every so often throughout the first presentation. I will receive those good vibes and I will know who they are from. All right, so listening can be hard to define. It's kind of like the term communication itself, where if you ask 10 different scholars to define it, you'll get 11 different opinions. But that's okay, because we all have our own working definition of what the word listening means. So here's a sample definition. And I'm going to use this sample definition as a typical working definition of listening that people may have, and we'll illustrate a few points with it. First, I'll try to pick the definition apart word by word to show that listening is a very expansive concept, and then we'll narrow it back down into a specific direction for our purposes today. And for the sake of time, I'll glide through my commentary on the words and clauses in this definition sort of rhetorically and in a abbreviated manner. So, understanding spoken information between two people in a conversation. We can take issue with almost any word in this definition and start off with, what about that word spoken? Does listening have to be something that happens out loud, or can we listen to nonverbal messages as well? Next up, the word understanding. The only problem I have with the word understanding is that I think it defines listening too narrowly. In other words, is understanding what listening is, or are there other elements involved with the process of listening as well? I think that there are other integral parts that aren't captured by the word. But most definitions have some kind of verb in them somewhere, whether it's understanding, or some people use the word to hear is often in these kinds of sample definitions, which would bring up the same question as a moment ago with the word spoken. I personally do not believe that listening should be defined as auditorily only, because if we think about listening as part of the communication process with someone sending messages and someone receiving messages, listening is that receiving part, and all kinds of messages can be sent and received, not just spoken messages. So listening is more expansive than this. You can take issue with the word two. Does listening have to be between two people? Can it be between more people? Can it be with just one person? Can we not also like listen to ourselves, which is a healthy practice to engage in every now and then. And what about the word people? People listen to non-human animals, for example. I know that my dog Peppercorn would be very offended by the anthropocentric nature of this definition we have here today. But also, people listen to spirits and divine beings. All these different kinds of listening have different characteristics and can be studied and are important in people's lives. Information. Well, does the content that we listen to have to be information? What about appreciative listening, where we listen to music or to birds? I have to say, like, sorry, birds, can't listen to you. You're not conveying information. Of course not. And then finally, this last clause in a conversation narrows it down unnecessarily to a specific context. But of course, listening can take place in any context. But I do like this last clause because it does draw our attention to the conflict piece. So without lingering on this definition exercise for too much longer, I want to just draw a couple of takeaways before we go on to the next slide. First, we might venture a simple working definition of listening and call it accurately receiving messages. Although, as we'll see here in a little bit, I think even this definition leaves out something important about the kind of listening we'll be talking about today. I also want to highlight that listening is part of a process that is multi-step, that involves hearing and understanding, as well as remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and all of these are discrete steps that are compressed together and taken for granted when we engage in listening activities. And third, context. As mentioned above, different contexts call for different types of listening. We might listen differently or employ different listening strategies when we're at a music venue versus when we're at the doctor's office, for example. There's just different strategies that we might engage in. For today's purposes, we'll focus on listening that occurs in dyadic relationships. That is to say, listening like between friends, relational listening. And we're going to focus on this specific slice of listening because this is typically what people think of when they think of listening, the kind of activity that takes place between friends, between coworkers, family members, and so on. I have the picture of Alexa on the screen there because I want to highlight the fact that, Amazon's Alexa does a great job of accurately receiving messages, but what Alexa does is typically not what we think of when we think of listening. There's this intangible relationship piece that is baked into the cake. So we have this term relationally oriented listening, which is defined as the dynamic, interdependent, and uniquely human process of signaling attention, affection, empathy, understanding, and responsiveness through a vast repertoire of specific behaviors. So let me pause for a second and ask you a question. Who is the best listener that you know? Someone in your life. For now, I'd like you to just have an image in your mind of a specific person. Do you have a name and face in mind? Now let me ask you this. And for this question, feel free to type your answer into the chat, but don't hit send just yet. The question is, what is your relationship to that person? So this might be a coworker or a family member, partner, parent, or coach. Everyone got it? For those of you who are participating, We don't need the person's name necessarily, just how they're connected to you. Feel free to hit enter and send your responses now. So take a look at what we've got here. Friend, partner, spouse, my husband, close friends. And this is great. This is highlighting the important role that listening plays in our most important relationships. And now let me expand the question and ask, why? Now that we have a specific person in mind, thanks, Amber. Now that we have a specific person in mind, I want to encourage verbal responses at this point. If anyone would like to chime in and talk about the specific behaviors or what it is about that person that makes them a good listener, in your opinion.
I think I didn't use the raise hand function, but we can talk, right?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay.
Thanks, Christina.
Sorry, I'm a verbal processor and I'm a slow typer. I chose my husband as being a good listener because I think one of the things that makes him a very good listener is that he knows me very well. So he knows what I prefer in him listening to me and understands what I'm like, meaning isn't as lost in what I'm saying.
Good point that listening is so specific to the individual relationship, and there are so many different response styles and different people prefer different types of responses. Anyone else? Okay. If we go back to the definition on the previous slide, I want to emphasize that last word, specific behaviors. These behaviors show us that we have been heard. So in a conversation, we generally don't want our messages to be received passively and silently. We want to be actively acknowledged. And I have my picture there. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? There are some people who study listening who argue that, especially in the context of relational listening, if no response has occurred in response to the message that was sent, then listening hasn't happened. And I'll repeat that because I find it a kind of a provocative claim. Some people argue that if no response has occurred to show that a message has been received, then it can't be said that listening has taken place at all. And so this highlights the centrality of the importance of response. Earlier, when we were talking about the elements of the listening process, hearing and understanding, remembering, evaluating, we didn't mention response. And I think that's an important piece that's often left off. An example could be, so let's imagine that somebody is playing video games. And I'm using this example because I love to play video games, Super Smash Brothers. And person's playing video games in a room and someone comes into the room behind them and says something, maybe about their plans for that day. And the person playing video games hears that person, but makes no response at all, doesn't pause the game, doesn't turn around and acknowledge what was said. In that scenario, if you ask the person who's standing behind the video game player whether listening occurred, what are they likely to say in that scenario? No, they don't feel listened to because they have no idea at all whether the person heard them or not. And so there's so many examples that we can look at for this, but response is so important in and showing that listening happened. That's why listening is so hard to measure. It's a cognitive process that is exhibited, behaviorally. Okay. This gets us over to our concept of verbal person-centeredness. Verbal person-centeredness is the extent to which a supportive message reflects an awareness of and adaptation to the subject, the subjective, affective, and relational aspects of a communication context. Verbal person-centeredness can happen in a number of levels or not happen. So we have low person-centeredness, LPC. These kinds of messages condemn, ignore, or deny people's emotions. We have moderately person-centered messages, which implicitly recognize people's feelings and often attempt to divert their attention away from stress. And then we have high person-centered messages, which have the characteristics of acknowledging, validating, and contextualizing people's emotions. So in the next couple of slides and for the rest of our session, we'll be looking not just at messages that convey simply information, but messages that have an emotional element to them as well. So research suggests that individuals can experience positive physical, mental, and relational outcomes following the reception of high quality verbal person-centered support. A listener's supportive message will tend to facilitate the development of intimacy, whereas a disinterested or disparaging response will tend to hinder it. This is a picture that we're looking at of Dr. Brant Burleson, who was a professor of communication at Purdue University for more than 30 years. His early research on this topic appeared in 1987 in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology. And there's research on these concepts up to the present day. Dr. Burleson died in 2010. So the reason this concept is important, I think, is because high person-centeredness is a predictor of relationship satisfaction. And of course, relationship satisfaction is a predictor of relationship longevity. So listeners are collaborators. When we communicate, we're engaged in a meaning-making process. And we need to bounce our perceptions off of people in order to form them and confirm them. Listeners work with the speaker to co-create meaning by validating emotion. What do we mean by validating emotion? Helping people decide what they think about an event or how to react. A key point here is people want the stories that they tell about their lives to be coherent. And so, for example, if they're telling a positive story and we, the listener, don't agree with them that it is positive, or even if we simply fail to confirm that it is positive, we can throw the whole meaning of their story into question. And we'll look at a few examples coming up next. Good listeners affirm emotion. So technically, feelings are natural and voluntary responses to stimuli, and therefore cannot be wrong in and of themselves. Emotions could be harmful under some circumstances, but their arising is natural. And so one of the many jobs of the good listener is to say, what you're feeling is legitimate. You're not crazy for feeling this way. And this can be a messy process. So we'll look at some examples. Strategies for responding to positive emotion, as well as strategies for responding to negative emotion. All right, switching gears. Responding to positive emotion, we have basically these responses can be categorized into two groups. The active constructive responses and the passive destructive responses. Active constructive responses make the receiver feel good and boost their self-esteem. So the happy person is confirmed in their happiness. We ask them questions and invite the person to elaborate. Whereas passive destructive responses make the receiver feel bad and hurts their self-esteem, changes the subject. This can happen deliberately, but it can also happen accidentally if we're just not, thinking. And this is problematic for the speaker and for the relationship. So to illustrate, let's look at an example which will appear on the top of the slide. Move my camera again. Grace is talking to a friend about getting a promotion and receiving new responsibilities at work. The addressee responds. If we're looking at an active constructive response, it might sound like this. Yay, they're lucky to have you. How do you want to celebrate? So notice it's affirming, it asks questions, invites the person to continue the conversation. Whereas a passive destructive response might sound like this. So you have to do more work now at that same crappy place? Sorry, bro. All right. So here this friend thought he had good news, but now he's not so sure. Maybe he's not so sure he has a good friend. One of the two things isn't so good. Let's turn our attention to from positive over to negative. We have similarly, there are two categories that our responses can fall into when we are responding to someone who's expressing negative emotion. There are supportive listeners who suspend judgment, operate from the perspective of the distressed other, use full sentences and questions to move the conversation toward a productive narrative whole. And then there are unsupportive listeners, creatively named unsupportive listeners. They sound judgmental and evaluative. They do not move the conversation forward or may not respond at all. So in this case, at this point in the session, we'll look at two examples here. And for the second example, I'll ask for your help. But first we'll do the first example. All right, Perry's boyfriend of 7 years cheated on her, left her, and married another woman. Carrie confides this to her friend who responds. So I used these scenarios in class a couple of semesters ago, and the following responses are from students used with permission. Oh, hell no, he left a queen like you for her. And then I think this next one is pronounced, psh, he doesn't deserve you anyway. Let's get out of here. It's half-price pints at Patton and my homie Rob is in town. Or we have the unsupportive listener who says, you should have cheated on him a long time ago. I knew he didn't love you. All right. So I'll bring back up to the screen the characteristics of the supportive response and the unsupportive response, and you can see how they are illustrated in these examples. Next, we'll go over another example of negative emotion. And before we display this one, I would ask those of you who choose to participate to please choose a number between 1 and 10. Choose any number between 1 and 10. And this is just to divide you up into two groups. So once you've got your number, and don't change it, if you have chosen an even number, I'll ask you to write a supportive example of the following scenario. And if you've chosen an odd number, I'll ask you to write an unsupportive example of the following scenario. Feel free to, you can go like overboard to try to be illustrative in these sample responses. And there are a whole bunch to choose from, but I just chose one for our session today. Here's the example. Jada is in high school. She receives this semester's grades. They're a lot better than previous semester's grades, but she is discouraged. She says, I really tried hard to get my grades up this semester. Jada's parents respond. So at this time, feel free to type your responses into the chat, and you do not have to specify whether it's an example of supportive or unsupportive. We'll read through them after you send them, and we should be able to guess. Go ahead and enter your responses now, for those of you who are participating. I've noticed for those folks who watch the recording of these videos later, they won't be able to see the chat. So I will read some of them out. We're getting a lot of great examples here. I'm going to characterize these as unsupportive examples first. Things like, you must not have tried hard enough. If you didn't play so many sports, you could probably concentrate on your studies. You really are not trying hard enough to raise your grades. You need to work harder. Here's one that says, I'm sure that it's frustrating to feel like you put so much work and you didn't get the result you were hoping for. I hope you can do better next semester, exclamation point. Oh, and school is always hard for me too. Why stress about it? The touching ones are so touching and the negative ones are so crushing. I know that college is hard and you are discouraged, but you improved so much. We are very proud of you. I'm sorry you didn't get the result that you hoped for. It's disappointing feeling like the work you put in didn't pay off as you wanted. And so that one acknowledges the emotion that wasn't explicitly named, but it puts lays a finger on the emotion of disappointment. And Nora says, this was good experience for the next opportunity though. Great points. We'll have an opportunity to sort of reflect on these activities and these examples more holistically here in just a moment when we conclude the presentation today. But for now, I want to go ahead and just sort of draw some big picture, conclusions. Positive listening experiences. When we feel listened to or heard, we feel valued, as if the person really cares about us and our well-being. Positive listening experiences help to create, maintain, and enhance positive relationships of all kinds. The simple act of validating another can go a long way. And, you know, as it was mentioned earlier, there's so many. I just had some technical difficulties on my end. Can you guys still hear me all right? Thank you. There are so many different kinds of listening styles, and every single relationship that we have is different. And so we do have to tailor our responses to the person and to the situation. But so often when we respond, you know, in the moment, we're living our lives day by day, and we don't get advanced warning that some emotional situation might be right around the corner. We might not respond mindfully every single time. So just being, I think, aware of these concepts in general help to sensitize us to their existence. And I'm also reminded too of the fact that communication, well, and listening specifically, is a skill. And just like any other skill, it can be improved with practice. None of us are perfect at it all the time. And so I think it helps to be reminded every so often of these important concepts. And that brings me to the end. I'm going to open the floor up for questions and general comments and discussion. Did receive twinkle fingers throughout the presentation from those of you who are silent, and I appreciate that from all of you. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions, comments? Thank you so much, Jay.
You are very welcome.
There will, as always, be a recording of this, and you might want to think about as you sort of go about your day, how some of this information